I am.
All right. Well,
I am here now. Sounds like I'm audible.
yes, you are. Yeah. Thanks for joining us.
Okay, you are very welcome. Um, and thanks for sharing my slides. That definitely makes things a little bit simpler. Um, for those of you who don't know me, and I think that's many of you, I've never spoken before this group before. I am an air quality planner at Oregon DEQ in the air quality planning section. And this rulemaking, or really this project that I'm going to be talking about with you today, came about from the cross-agency work of the Department of DEQ, Land Conservation and Development, ODOT, of course, and the Department of Energy. And that was around the Every Mile Counts effort and putting forward projects and rulemakings regarding reducing emissions from transportation and things that could be done relatively, not necessarily simply, but things that didn't require new legislation, and that each of our agencies had the ability and the authority to do. So that's how this project came to be, and it came to land with me, and I'll be the lead rule writer and kind of project manager of getting this rulemaking underway. And if we could go to the next slide, please. Yeah, perfect. I'm sure many of you are aware that Oregon has a mandatory employee commute options program underway, and it's been in place for about 20 years, a little more than 20 years, since 1996 in the Portland metropolitan area. This program requires employers that have more than 100 employees at a work site to offer commuting options to their employees. And the particular requirements of the employers are to survey their employees about how they get to work, and then to report to DEQ on, before they report to DEQ, the employers have to provide DEQ a transportation plan, or really a commute reduction plan. So a series of incentives that they will offer their employees to get to work by some other means than driving alone. And then they need to report to DEQ every 2 years about how they are doing meeting a reduction target, which is 10% below their baseline or their first survey. So this is just a map that shows where those employers are located across the Portland region, and about the color coding that just kind of gives you a picture, an idea of how the size range of those employers shakes out. And let's see, I guess that I would also just mention on this slide that just emphasize that the rule does not require employers to have particular incentives. What they choose for their commute option or their transportation reduction plan is up to them. They just need to have one, basically. And there also isn't a requirement that they attain that 10% reduction. That is not an enforceable provision of the rule. It's just having the plan and doing the survey and making a good faith effort to implement it. Okay, next slide, please. So one of the first questions that I had at the beginning of starting this work was, really how much, more or less, of pollution emissions, transportation emissions, can we attribute to the commuter, the average commuter? And so I asked one of our modelers, air quality modelers at DEQ, whose specialty is transportation emissions and running moves and so forth, and ask James to help me kind of ballpark this so I could essentially provide some information in another presentation I was doing last year. So coming up with ultimately what the magic answer was 37%, but involved a lot of assumptions, obviously. So it's a relatively simplistic calculation, but I think it still gives kind of a good idea. Like this is not an insubstantial amount of pollution emissions that could be coming from people driving back and forth to work. And so we started with just on-road vehicle emissions on a weekday. Again, this is all tailored to the Portland metro region, separated out emissions from passenger cars and freight cars, then separated out weekdays and weekends, and then made a very not rash assumption, but very an assumption that we would just look at the rush hour traffic, essentially, that sort of 7-ish in the morning and 5-ish in the afternoon. And based on the vehicle miles traveled at that time, James ran the numbers, and it came out to be that was about 37% of the greenhouse gas emissions that were being emitted in that, from transportation in that time frame was coming from folks presumably driving back and forth to work. Next slide, please. So after 20 years, again, of running this program, we can pretty confidently state that the program has helped to significantly reduce greenhouse gas emissions and other pollutants too, which I'll talk about in a minute. And, again, I'll rephrase that slightly. Instead of saying reduce, and say really prevent, because this is, again, about emissions that never happen, right? Because people are leaving their cars at home. And I'll talk again in just a second about how we come up with this number, but for 2019, the year before the world fell apart, well, the world was falling apart in 2019 too, but before the pandemic anyway, and all the effects that had on transportation, the calculations that we do in the employee commute option program showed that somewhere in the neighborhood of 36,000 metric tons of CO2 were being kept out of the atmosphere, let's say, from this program, from people having incentives to take other means to get to work besides driving their car. So that sounds great, and it is great, but what are the assumptions that go, what are the assumptions behind those calculations? So the first is that we base that on the number of employers that reported that year. And because we have biennial reporting, that probably represents about half of the employers. There's about 1,000 total employers in the Portland metro region, and about 500-ish of them reported in 2019. So right there, that's maybe only half of what was actually prevented in terms of emissions. Second thing is that we are making an assumption about what a commute length would be, and we take that from the metro area household survey. So the average commute length we're assuming in our calculations is 19.6 miles. We're assuming that someone is driving, or I should say commuting to work 250 days in a year. And when you chunk those numbers out, the vehicle miles, I'll say reduced or prevented, is 74 million vehicle miles that were not driven in that year, 2019. And then we use emission factors in terms of how many gallons of fuel that would have been, and then by pollutant, how many, what is the pollutant content of a gallon of fuel, and come up with, in this one instance, the 36,000 metric tons of CO2, but there are obviously calculations that go along with volatile organics and NOx and other constituents that we can calculate as well. Okay, quickly, I'll move on to the next slide. And I just want to give a nod to the other pollutants besides greenhouse gases that are being again, not emitted because of this program. And this is part of a different analysis that was done a couple of years ago in the Technical Services Department of DEQ. And just to show what some of the toxic air contaminant benefits of having ECO are, models were run having ECO in place and not having ECO in place. And we just learned that tens to hundreds of tons of a number of air toxics were also not being emitted because employee commute options is in place. So important program, definitely we're deriving good air quality benefits from having it. So the next question, and that would be the next slide. If we were to expand the such a mandatory employer-based commute option program beyond Portland, how big is the problem elsewhere? What gains might we see for air quality in other parts of the state? And this is just, again, a very simple graph from based on data from the American Community Survey that shows, not surprisingly, that in these particular counties that I chose to look at, that a large majority of commuters in urban and urbanized and suburbanized areas and other parts of the state, large majorities of folks are driving their own car to their jobs. And this is based on, just as a matter of clarity, based on, let's see, workers that are 16 and over and their journey to work. So that's the American Community Survey data that I looked at to generate this graph. And then next slide, please. Should be the map of Eugene. And so how might we bring some of the benefits of commute options programming to other parts of the state? What should we be considering as we're doing this rulemaking? I mean, we certainly know from, again, ECO having operated in the Portland area for a couple of decades, from the transportation option program that ODOT runs. And I've been working really closely with Stephanie Millar over the past year or so. We know there are huge benefits even aside from air quality, right? In terms of potential economic benefits to employers themselves in terms of, promoting themselves as good places to work, having their employees be, have a better work-life balance and being healthier and having more, relaxing ways to get to work than necessarily, duking it out on the freeway in bumper to bumper traffic. So that's great. But we also think are pretty confident that we can bring air quality benefits to other parts of Oregon as well. And how would we design and develop the rules to support such a statewide program? Ideally, that it would be one that supports good programs that are already in place. I'll talk about that in a second, and really meets the local, both, transportation and environmental needs and goals of those communities, as well as helping workers get to work more easily and more conveniently, which is really probably the biggest motivator for employers to want to sign on, shall we say, to a program like this. So, and at the end of the day, it would be a new regulatory program and new regulations. So we need to be thinking about geographic applicability. Would it apply, and would the employers to be regulated be, would we use that same 100 employee threshold? Would it just apply to employers that are within a metropolitan planning organization or, an urbanized area? Even with that would be a lot. If we were to have the applicability be to employers of 100 or more employees at a work site in metropolitan planning area boundaries, that would be about 600-ish more employers that would be now regulated under a commute option program. As I mentioned, there's about 1,000 in the Portland area. So it's not exponential, but it's also not insignificant to think about managing a program. It's kind of more or less kind of doubling the size of it. And thinking about like the reduction target. So 10% is what applies in the Portland area. Is that the right number, right? I mean, not that there's necessarily one right number, but would that be a reasonable target to apply in different areas of the state? Just as an example, something to think about, Washington's commute reduction rule, the jurisdictions themselves, or I should say the areas in which the regulation applies, set their own targets for reduction, and they need to be at least as stringent as the state target, but they can set other targets as well. So, just some different ways that the program could be designed. Okay, next slide, please. And I just would like to make the point with this slide that as we are developing the rules for a statewide program, that we have a lot of goals in mind. And perhaps the most fundamental of which is creating something that builds on the success, knowing that there are many transportation option programs operating throughout the state, again, supported by, guided by, under the technical advisement of the ODOT Transportation Options Program. And ideally, DEQ's rule would complement and support the work that's already going on. And we also want to make sure that as we're developing this rule, that it's informed by really all the actors that are portrayed in this slide, but particularly the employers that would be regulated, community-based organizations that are advocating for transportation and environmental justice, and the workers themselves, right, that have needs about getting to work safely, conveniently, having a good work-life balance, and being, health benefits being supported. And I don't think I need to belabor the point, but just that, it's perhaps, when it's written down on paper, it won't look all that complicated, but I think keeping all the goals in mind that we want to be able to achieve with this is going to make it a bit of I think a very kind of a fun exercise, but also, I want to be sure that we are being methodical and listening, right, to the various stakeholders that are going to be affected by this. Okay, next slide. So having said all that, DEQ has been, thinking and envisioning ways that the current eco rules can be enhanced and strengthened in the Portland area, and some elements that we probably would want to carry forward to a statewide rule. It's, again, it's not going to be a cookie cutter, one size fits all. But one of the ideas that we've had about certain practices to incorporate into a new rule, as well as enhancing the existing rule, is to collect more geographic information and have a better understanding about, and perhaps that's through surveys, perhaps that, well, I'll talk about in the next slide about other places we might get that information, but trying to have a better understanding of where people are traveling from and what the transportation options available to them are in those locations. That is going to be very different, obviously, in the Portland area than it is in other parts of the state. We may be looking at travel information by census block or by zip code, or be asking employers to supply that information or ask their employees. It would probably have to be voluntarily shared, right, where they're traveling from. But that could tell us a lot. And another way we're thinking of enhancing current Portland rules, as well as bringing this forward to a statewide rule, would be setting some particular standards for what a transportation option plan that an employer submits. It needs to meet a certain threshold. And again, not planning on mandating particular practices or incentives, but perhaps like assigning, let's say, a point value, knowing that certain incentives and transportation demand management strategies are a lot more effective than others. So paying people like by a subsidized transit pass, or by giving them the sort of cash equivalent of what a parking space would be worth at their work site, are very effective in getting people to leave their cars at home. And other strategies, maybe not so much. Just maybe installing a bike rack at the office is maybe not as an effective strategy. So anyway, with collecting a little bit more information, I think we can do a better job of certainly reducing emissions, but also communicating what the benefits of the program are. And the next slide, yeah, there we go, is I hope this can be the start of a conversation with this group about the right ways to measure program effectiveness, and how we can align how DEQ is measuring some of the effects of an eco program with how other agencies are measuring reduced emissions from transportation strategies and different kinds of planning. So I mentioned the assumptions that we make when I walked through the calculation to come up with the 36,000 tons of CO2 not emitted. And essentially those savings are based on emissions from burning emission factors saved from burning a gallon of fuel. And we'd likely want to either update emission factors to apply them in a statewide context, or at least make sure that among our agencies that we are using the same emission factors. If we're talking about this strategy reduces greenhouse gas by this much, that we're again using the same emission factors. Second thought, DEQ doesn't currently track mode splits in the eco program. We're just, based on the employer surveys, we're tracking the rate of single driver auto trips. So we don't really know which methods are people using most in terms of other, active transportation and transit modes. So should we start tracking now? Should we start measuring how the different mode split works out over time or in different regions of the state? And at a minimum, for a statewide rule, we're going to need to make sure that inputs to models and calculations are right, representative, obviously, of that geographic area. And the obvious example is the commute length that we use from the household survey in Portland of 19.6 miles. We're going to need to use different commute lengths if we mimic that same sort of method of calculation. We're going to have regionally appropriate data to do that calculation. Maybe we can supplement employer information with other data sources like the ODOT and DLCD place type geographic information. Perhaps we can combine data sources to be able to tell a story about how effective transportation options and commute options are in different parts of the state, given the tools that people have in those areas. and how their commutes differ in those areas. And of course, there's lots of other ways that we can and other programs do demonstrate the effectiveness of their commute option program ordinances, calculating health benefits through the EPA BenMap, and being able to say in a dollar amount, this program saves this much of healthcare costs. We can do translations, I guess, into like traffic lanes that aren't needed, miles of congestion avoided. So there's lots of ways that we can communicate this information, but what's going to be the most effective in different parts of the state, and what would we have enough sort of data for to be able to give a credible measurement of whether or not this is working. So I would love to have input and ideas from all of you on measurement, how we measure success of this program, what kinds of data should we be collecting and asking for, and how can we make sure that all of our agencies are kind of comparing apples to apples when we're talking about reduction of transportation emissions from different transportation strategies. And then the next slide is just a bit of a timeline. We are going to be within the next few weeks, our advisory committee will be meeting. The poll just closed yesterday for trying to find a date for 20-some people to meet. It's going to be a big advisory committee. And the aim is to have draft rules for public notice in the fall. There will be a public hearing and opportunities for public comment, of course, and we hope to bring rules to our commission in early 2023, our Environmental Quality Commission. So I'd be happy to answer any questions, or please feel free to follow up at my email address, and I'd love to talk with you more about this.
All right, great. Thanks for all that information, Karen. Does anybody have any either questions or maybe thoughts back to the performance measure monitoring questions that Karen had?
I had a quick comment, not so much a question, but I thought it was interesting how you were breaking apart travel into these different segments, and just an anecdote from work we've done. I was trying to pull it up while you're talking, but I couldn't quickly find it. But a lot of times people will talk about like the number of trips, and so I'm trying to remember some of the statistics, but I think it's something like 50% of the trips are 3 miles or less, or something like that. And so, like the point being, there's a really long tail, and I think that gets to what you're talking about, that commuting trips is just like this large percentage of the VMT, and they're not so much a huge percentage of the number of trips, but when you look at the miles that commute trips travel, it's a very large amount, a much bigger percentage than you would expect. So anyways, the numbers were aligning with my expectations. I just wanted to kind of say we've also looked at it from kind of trying to explain the difference between what a trip is versus the length of a trip.
Mm-hmm. Great. Thanks for that. Thanks for that feedback.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. Tara.
Yeah, Karen, great to have you here sharing this. I know it got pushed down the road a little bit, so glad to see a timeline here. And I think that the one thing I didn't hear you mention that these people, I think is important, is the Get There tool, right? That is the new ride-sharing app that replaces sort of the Drive Less, Save More, but it's like the new modern version that you can have on your cell phone and do a lot more things with it. And there's been talk that probably not requiring, but maybe make an easy glide slope. So that could be the reporting mechanism to help this. And that might make it easier to collect some of the data that you talked about. So then the thing I wanted to add in addition to that is in the list of things that you might do, I think the one thing that we're struggling with right now is that the diversity of people's vehicles is like, my neighbor might have an electric vehicle that he solar charges, and I'm driving a big SUV, whatever. So like, because we're in this environment, just assuming this average for residents that live in a certain area, could we just ask them for, make and model of their vehicle? That's, would help us some. VIN coding or VIN number is probably going to be too invasive, but maybe even just asking them for the MPG of their vehicle. Yeah, I don't know. So I feel like because it's so variable, that might be a piece of information we grab as well as the other things you mentioned. Definitely, it's been trip based, so moving to more detail so we can actually get the distance is key, and then knowing more about what mode options they have. So in support of all those other things, but adding the idea of tell us more about your vehicle.
Right on. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, Mike.
Hi, Karen. And I will get back to you. I've been on vacation, so I haven't seen your emails or responded to your emails. I just got back today.
Good for you. I hope you had a great one.
Yeah. Well, this weather did not help. Anyway, I'm curious, what kind of discussion has there been already at the Environmental Quality Commission? Did they give any guidance? Have they had this topic brought to them to, start, or is this just so far at the staff level? And the EQC have they been, briefed about this coming rule? Because, these things can get quite controversial. People are concerned about their privacy and
sure.
And asking to have rules applied to them, et cetera, et cetera. So
it has not. We have not briefed the commission yet. So this has just been at the staff management level. And having said that, and Tara alluded to this, I started this project last year, and it got put on the back burner for some other policy work that needed to happen first. But I've made a good number of public presentations, so it's not a secret that DEQ is undertaking this work, but probably only the transportation wonks and active transportation advocates and stuff are paying attention. But having said all that, the answer is no. The EQC has not been briefed, and funny you should ask that, because just in the last couple of days, some emails came across my desk about doing just that and planning for a briefing to the commission. So soon, probably before the heat of summer, we'll have a few minutes before the EQC to kind of tell them what we're up to. And again, I mean, the rulemaking has been on the rulemaking agenda, on the rulemaking calendar for some time, but that's not a place where many people would know to go looking. So, So yes, the controversy may be yet to come. Yes.
And I'm sure you've had your share of controversy with other rulemaking, not you personally, but the department this last 2 years. So you're used to controversy.
Somewhat. I mean, important work. People have very strong opinions about just pollution reduction is generally, people have very strong opinions about how to accomplish it, for sure.
Yeah.
Thanks, Jeffrey.
Yeah. Hey, Karen.
Hello.
Nice to see you.
I know you.
Hello, yes. You mentioned sort of offhand here just a few slides back about the need for emission factors that everybody could use, right? Were you asking for their creation because this group is going to be creating those? James is going to be creating those.
Oh, good. Yeah. So yeah, here's a great example of interagency, embarrassing on my part, lack of intersection communication. So the reason I brought it up here, Jeffrey, was really to make a plug for across agencies using either using the same emission factors or being clear about what emission factors we're using. And I say this as a planner, not as a modeler. So I may be, I'm obviously talking to a crew that my ignorance is going to be glaringly obvious, but I guess anecdotally, I have had, I'm under the impression and have had some cross-agency conversations about how we calculate things differently, and we use different assumptions and we use different model inputs. And both of us might be saying XYZ amount of pollution is being prevented by this program. And I was just advocating for across agencies, as much as we can be consistent in the inputs and the calculations and the emission factors that we are using in our models, so much the better. But and if we're not being consistent, that's okay. It's just we should know that, so that when we're explaining what our data means, we're being, I guess, fully transparent about that. So yeah, that's all I was getting at.
And I would agree, Jeffrey, that on average we're getting it right, but my point was that this isn't an average, right? We are talking about individuals. Maybe you're at a firm and it only has 100 people. They may not be average, and so trying to get something a little bit deeper than the emission rates. That yes, we are coordinating, and that's exciting. The other comment I had was wanting to open it up to this group to think a little bit about that target, right? I think you said like, is it 10% or something like this? Those discussions. I think that a lot of people in our plans don't do a lot with the travel demand management, or at least that's sort of my impression, that it's not often in our bread and butter of what we're doing in our travel model. So I don't know, I guess I wanted to open that here and see if people, did have thoughts on that, or, concerns or thoughts, or just where is that at? And do we need to do more of that, as a modeling group to start to get at some of these things? So trying to encourage others to share where they're at with travel demand management programs and analysis of those, and what kind of targets would be helpful or not.
Anyone have any thoughts on that question from Tara about how you're dealing with travel, with demand management in your tools and analysis currently? I'm not seeing anyone jump in on that. I think that's sort of one of those that we have identified part of through all the GHG TUSNO, pricing, travel demand management things to get better at in our tool sets, Tara.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
It always tends to be like a, off model, post process kind of thing, right, Tara? And so, we just haven't cracked that nut in a, explicit way, it seems like. Some of those programs lend themselves better to, accounting for them more explicitly in the model platform than others, but yeah, we need to get better at it.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are some off the shelf, but I also, am aware of a lot of really interesting and maybe more effective TDM type programs that are happening, like the transportation wallet, where they give you scooter passes. And, so it's just like, how do we even model these things,
Right.
is a challenge. It's not easy, they're diverse.
I think the ABM is going to give us a lot of power, but as I think about these things sometimes, I think that the challenge that we probably all know is the hard part is going to be determining what parts of the population are participating.
Yeah.
So the ABM will give us the ability to kind of toggle on, almost any TDM program you could want to code up. So we will have that rich ability to do that, but it's all about. So the tricky thing then is about, well, which populations are getting to participate.
And really, I think that's what we're talking about here, because Karen's going to have a big data set of surveys, right? So if we ask the right questions in those surveys, which right now they're just saying trips, SOV, or other, right? So we'd like to get a more diverse set, and we could actually sort of fine tune those models, right? But I don't think what they're collecting now, which, Karen is talking about expanding. So I think that's why the intersection with OMSC is to think about, what at a bare minimum would we want to get out of that survey that could help us? And I don't think we're talking like a rigorous survey, like, you know, Chris, you're going out and doing a lot more of that, right, with that consultant and everything. So we may not get to that holy grail, but there might be something intermediate here where we could kind of check on our models and, like you're saying, which populations are doing this. So if we would know more demographics about the people who are picking up a scooter or an active lifestyle versus others, we could help with our models. So I think that's exactly the bullseye here of, you know, what puts Karen on our agenda is a two-way street of, you know, us helping her with what we might contribute and what data would be useful to come back to us.
Yeah, and I guess for me, I would make that connection back up to the conversation with Cody a little bit, Tara, on the climate friendly. To me, there's this big question about the future year demographics and allocations and what kind of what information we want to tie to that demographic population in the future. And this would be one of those is, do we do that and how do we do that? Because that's what the models, that's, you know, inputs the models need to do all of this work. And that's going to, so I think that's going to be a bit larger conversation than maybe people are anticipating, and a really, really important one, because that's going to drive most of the decisions for people, right? And I think that's kind of what Alex was getting at too, and everybody's touching on, man, how do you do that and get a good allocation of that and apportionment to demographic makeups for the future, right? Mike, did you have a thought?
Yeah, you know, when you brought that up earlier, Brian, I was thinking back to something Sonny Condor at Metro many, many years ago said. We were just having casual conversations about this thing about, you know, we assume that in the higher density compact development areas in Metro, people are, you know, walking a lot more or taking their bike or using less vehicles because of the built environment. And he was questioning that. He was saying, well, it's kind of self-selective. People who like to do those things move into those areas because they are those type of people. They are, that's their choices. And it's not so much the built environment that changed them. It's they are those people that moved into that built environment. So can we assume a built environment is going to change people's natural behavior or just attract people who normally just would do that anyway? So it's kind of a chicken and egg question. It's a good philosophical question.
Yeah, but then there's probably and there's probably those groups that would be inclined to do it if the infrastructure was there to do it, right? So there's kind of all maybe 3 or 4 different segments to that. It's a good one. Plus, you tend to get smaller households making fewer trips in those higher density developments. So yeah, there's a lot of things that come into play there, right? Well, I think we're running on